a lot of the countries that are part of the Belt Road, China and India and Russia, and these are countries that are accumulating all of the gold and producing all of the gold. And you start to see this growing group of countries and kind of the isolation of the dollar. Now, this really didn't all fit into what I was talking about until shortly after 2021. 2020, the banks are still buying gold. And 2021 rolls around and we see the day that we leave Afghanistan in a very unharmonious way. Saudi Arabia, I think, at that point, signed the death warrant for the end of the petrodollar the day we left Afghanistan or the day after. And I think there is no coincidence in the timing. Saudi Arabia announces a joint military cooperation agreement with Russia. You know, I often ask...
And just to recap, leaving Afghanistan, deserting weapons, deserting allies, yes, deserting personnel.
Leaving our own servicemen and women behind enemy lines was something that would have been considered inconceivable in the United States that I grew up in. And I think that really signaled something to our allies and certainly to our foes. And, you know, I asked people what makes the dollar the world reserve currency, and most people don't know. But in 1974, 3 years after we closed the gold window, Kissinger went to Saudi Arabia and struck a deal with the Saudi kingdom and said, hey, we'll protect you, but for that, you'll denominate oil globally in dollars. And they have through OPEC. And this has created a massive synthetic demand for the dollar for the last 50 years. Signaling a change in that by a joint military cooperation agreement with Russia was a huge, huge move that really got very little, if any, attention in the Western media. But now things are really starting to click in for me, and I'm starting to see not only global de-dollarization, but also groupings that are growing together, like all 13 of the OPEC producing countries on the Belt Road, like shortly thereafter, China and Nigeria, who also signed the same contract with Russia, selling their gold to China for the petro-yuan bond, which is immediately convertible into gold on the Shanghai Gold Exchange. And this is how countries like Iran have sidestepped sanctions for quite some time, selling their oil to China for a bond that is immediately convertible into gold, and they take possession of it right off the Shanghai Gold Exchange. So these things are starting to speed up at this point, and I'm really starting to notice that there's a growing group of countries that are formulating around the BRICS that are, I think, coalescing against the dollar, the hypocrisy, the hegemony of the dollar. And you could see it, you could feel it, and you could watch all of the gold that was being sent eastward, and the accumulation and the de-dollarization. 2022 rolls along, and the weaponization of the dollar, as you mentioned, where I believe it's not the prerogative of the West to say who can and can't use the world reserve currency. It should be more for public opinion, not for the administrator of the currency to decide who can and can't use it. And it was that moment, and I often ask people, do you think this was intended? You know, we have 130 trillion in debt, 31 trillion that's on balance sheet, and Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security, which is 55 trillion underfunded in and of itself, and government military pensions, render us insolvent. Most of this debt accumulated at the lowest interest rates in human history. Was it intended? Did we want to pick a villain to create this great reset, to all of a sudden start the de-dollarization? And this is where the story gets very interesting as it turns from here.
Let's revisit some of those points there. So the dollar starts to unravel in this narrative when Saudi Arabia starts to make deals with China, yes, and the petrodollar is in jeopardy.
Yes.
So you're saying Saudi Arabia is now looking at Russia for protection.
Yes.
And if you're Saudi Arabia, you're thinking two things. For one thing, you're watching how the dollar was weaponized in the Russia invasion of Ukraine, and you're going, well, we don't want that. We can't have that happen to our assets. What if the US wakes up one morning and don't like our human rights policies, for example, or something else, or some other situation that could happen in the Middle East and decides to do the same to us? Maybe this isn't the best way to keep our reserves. But you've also got Russia not really projecting tremendous strength via this conflict in Ukraine. So why would the Saudis make such a bold decision before seeing who is the bigger military power in play?
Yes, that is part of the equation. That's a fair statement. This was before the Ukraine invasion, number one, and secondly, the day after these announcements came out, Zero Hedge ran an article saying Saudi Arabia announces to the world that their nuclear submarines are outfitted with hypersonic ICBMs. This is the technology the West doesn't have. The State Department commented and said they're very concerned about it. These are the missiles that can go Mach 10 up in the atmosphere and hit the ground at the speed of an asteroid. That was, I think, their way of saying, don't even try to do what you did to Gaddafi and Hussein. Don't even think about it. It was a veiled threat, let's say. And I think this is another reason why when you realize that also last year we see the Saudis say, well, we have submitted our application to the BRICS. So you have a growing unison of countries that are joining together that in and of themselves maybe can't project that strength, maybe can't stand up to the West, but together as a group, their militaries are stronger, their GDPs are bigger. I think it's a growing chorus of countries standing up to that hypocrisy, standing up to the West in a way that they've never been able to do in and of themselves. And
well, we'll leave the word hypocrisy aside for now, but let's just say standing up to a system where the U.S. can continue to print dollars, and then that makes the debt that they owe the U.S. become bigger and bigger and bigger.
Absolutely.
So we'll put aside the moral argument of the U.S.'s role on the global
stage.
stage.
And it is a perceived hypocrisy. I'm not saying it is, but that's their perception.
That's a fair enough point. So we're going to see this bifurcation of the global monetary system.
Absolutely.
Break that down in further detail. How does this play out from here?
Well, you have all of these countries joining the BRICS that you put them all together along with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the Belt Road. You're talking north of 80% of human population. And all it would take, now you have to remember, we're coming from a period of time where asset prices were blown sky high over the last several years with more money being created in the last 3 than in the history of the country preceding it. A lot of that money found its way into assets, and you have the misallocation and the distortions that are created by this. All it would take would be for Saudi Arabia to stand up on the stage, as they just told the folks at the Davos conference that we're now going to consider taking other currencies for oil. We've already been told that the BRICS currency would be pegged to gold or to commodities, and the assumption being gold being one of the commodities. I think all it would take would be Saudi Arabia to say to the West, thanks for the memories, it's been great, we appreciate it. But we're going to open up oil purchases in other currencies, not just dollars, maybe euros and ruble and rupee and gold. And all of a sudden, bang, all of the countries that have had to hold dollars for the last 50 years no longer really have any interest in holding them. And if they all start to dump dollars, and I think it would happen quickly, where they would all dump dollars, you have a tsunami of inflation hitting the shores of the West that would immediately create a spike in interest rates to compensate for the loss of purchasing power. This is how we see a great reset, as interest rates spike in relation to a crashing dollar, which then is inversely correlated to asset prices that have gone stratospheric over the last few years, and I would argue irrationally. And as interest rates spike and this inverse correlation hits the shores, stocks, bonds, and real estate, along with the crashing dollar, all collapse at the very same time. And when I ask, do you think it was intended? I guess I'm kind of tongue-in-cheek, but if you think about it, now you have a villain. Instead of blaming the Fed for creating these distortions and letting this happen, you have the Fed there saying they're going to raise rates, but they've done a woeful job at raising them high enough to tackle inflation.
All right, let's put a pause on that one before we get into the Great Reset, which I understand also opens the way for central bank digital currencies and a complete revamp of the system. And let's first focus on how we get to this de-dollarized global economy, or at least an economy where the dollar plays a less significant role. So in this bifurcation of the global monetary system, what relevance does the dollar have? It's still in play.
Yeah, the dollar will always have a relevance to it, and maybe it's not in its current state. But the thing that I think is really important to understand is that these agreements that are being made with the BRICS represent such a massive part of GDP and of population. At what point does the West decide to or attempt to trade with this group? Are they even going to be welcomed into it? I don't know. It just seems they're being isolated.
Well, because the dollar is so powerful and because the United States has enjoyed so much privilege having the global reserve currency, why would it just give it up without a fight?
Well, they will. They will fight, and they won't just give it up. But, you know, a lot of people will make the analogy to the euro, that all these countries came together and it didn't work. And I think there's something to be said for that. But when you look at all of these countries coming together in a similar rallying cry, for whatever that rallying cry is against the West, it is the backing of the new system by commodities, and perhaps all of it denoted on a distributed ledger. The digital yuan, which has been running for the last 4 years, backing the Belt Road to the tune of over 20 billion in successful transactions, would be, I believe, the rails to a new BRICS currency that would show the immutability of what every country pegged or pledged to the new system. That gives it the glue to make it work, where everyone has the same equal footing, equal say at the table. This, to me, is what would make the system work. As Zoltan Pozsar calls it, a new system backed by commodities, Bretton Woods 3, rather than a system backed by debt instruments and promises.